Hello everyone. Greetings from the Asia Pacific Forum on Sustainable Development in Bangkok, Thailand, and a very warm welcome to this global policy dialogue where we will be addressing future forward development planning in Asia and the Pacific. This event is hosted by the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, also known as UNDESA, with the cooperation of the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia. My name is Supha Pichumsai Nayutaya, or B in short, and I will be moderating today. Our focus in this discussion is the economic landscape for Asia and the Pacific in 2024, and especially how this affects the progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. As the basis for our discussions, we will explore the data from the World Economic Situation and Prospects 2024, or WESP report, as we call it for short, which is the flagship economic report issued by UNDESA. This report contains economic projections of the whole world, but we will look specifically into those for Asia and the Pacific. We will also discuss what to expect with regard to trade, investment, inflation, and more. In the second half of our discussion, we will discuss development planning in the region, particularly in small island developing states, or SIDS, as we say at the UN. In May, the UN will hold the 4th International Conference on SIDS in Antigua and Barbuda, where delegates from small islands and other countries will gather to formulate a new 10-year Sustainable Development Action Plan. We know that people in small islands are sitting at the forefront of climate change and are experiencing the worst effects of climate change, and we will explore that issue today as well. Now, before we dive in, here are some quick housekeeping. Multilingual captions are available in Zoom. Just click on the captioning icon at the bottom of your screens, and if you're joining via Zoom. And please do help spread the words on what you hear today on social media using the official hashtag WESP, W-E-S-P. So let's kick off today with a quick poll of you, our audience, to help us get to know you a little more. How do you feel about the economy where you live? We would love to know how you feel about the economy where you live right now. So do you feel very positive? Do you feel mostly positive? Or quite neutral, neither positive or negative? Or do you feel mostly negative or very negative? So we are doing the poll on Slido. I'll give you a minute to vote and get familiar with Slido. So just go to slido.com and use the hashtag WESP to vote, hashtag WESP. So meanwhile, let's watch a short video from UNDESA giving us a global view of the WESP report.
The world economy surprised us agreeably with its growth rate for last year. That is now estimated at 2.7%, up from the 2.3% we were expecting in May 2023. Behind the headline number, though, lie troubling vulnerabilities and stark differences across countries. Those are driving the forecast for 2024 down to 2.4%. That remains lower than the 3.1% annual average from 2000 to 2019. Years of easy liquidity have turned around, with interest rates now expected to stay higher for longer. That's contributing to slowing investments, increasing debt distress, and worsening fiscal conditions. Trade, a reliable engine of growth, is also sputtering. One other bit of good news: falling inflation comes with strings attached as well. Across the world, inflation is expected to be at an average of 3.9% in 2024, a decline of about a third from 2023. But in about a quarter of all developing countries, the forecast for 2024 is over 10%. That will be eating away what people's earnings can buy and inflicting further pain, especially on the middle class and those in poverty. All of this takes place as climate change is worsening, damaging economic prospects in both the short and long term, and calling for urgent transformative action at a time when the policy landscape itself is changing rapidly. Unconventional monetary policies are now part of the standard toolkit of central banks. Trade restrictions are rising, and industrial policies in developed countries seem to be here to stay. Developing countries must also revisit their policy options and priorities. Want to know how your country is doing? What we are recommending and why? Get the latest from our new report.
So we just saw that the global economic outlook is mixed between and within regions, and we would want to ask our guests about the effects on SDGs, and we will take a look at this further in the first discussion. But for now, let's have a look at the results from our first poll. All right, it seems that we've got two responses that's got the same amount of vote, neither positive or negative, and mostly negative. So a bit more on the negative side, I'd say. But it's good to know that the result that says very negative is very, very low at the bottom, very small amount, small proportion. Okay, well, this is going live, neither positive or negative. Okay, and this is voting from, I see 40 people participating on this live poll. Still neither positive or negative. Okay. And the second most popular is mostly negative, so we'll discuss about that more today. All right. Okay, so now that we've all warmed up to voting on Slido, we have another challenging question for you. This one's more challenging. Another poll. What do you think is the most needed action for improving the economic outlook in the region? So do you think it is improving job prospects or reducing inflation? Is it reducing debt, increasing trade, or do you think it is something else? What needs the most immediate action? So once again, go to slido.com and use the hashtag WESP. And while you are voting, please allow me to introduce our three guests for the first panel on understanding the latest economic forecast for Asia and the Pacific. So with me on stage are Shantanu Mukherjee, Director of the Economic Analysis and Policy Division at UN DESA, who we have just seen in the video. Hamza Ali Malik, Director of the Macroeconomic Policy and Financing for Development Division at UN ESCAP, and also Kuntanya Jangrajang, Associate Professor of Economics at Chulalongkorn University here in Bangkok. Thank you all so very much for joining us today. Now, before we dive into our conversation today, let's have a quick look together at the result of our second poll. Once again, back to the screen. All right, so what needs the most action for improving the economic outlook in the region? We have a lot of votes for improving job prospects. Some says reducing debts, reducing inflation, increasing trade is at the very bottom. This is live from about 50 participants, so we've got quite a clear answer that it's improving job prospects for most people participating in the poll. So that's another data that we can take into consideration when we discuss today. All right, having seen the poll results, let's see what our experts have to say about this issue. So Shantanu, can you please kick us off, and what does this mean for Asia and the Pacific?
Thanks, Bea, and I have to say it's really weird to be in front of you both in person and on the screen. At least one of those is AI, I guess, so we'll see. Well, you just heard a little bit about the global growth prospects. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Asia Pacific, but I'll also try to relate it to what's going on around this region. So in Asia Pacific, when we study it here in DESA, we split it up into East Asia and South Asia. And East Asian figures for 24-25 are in the region of around 4.5%. And South Asian growth prospects are in the region of 5 to 6% for 24-25. Now, The first point to take away is that there's huge diversity within these figures of these countries. Asia Pacific is not a particularly homogeneous kind of thing and dominated by some big players. So you have Timor-Leste, which is going into a huge contraction. You have the Maldives, which is doing pretty well. The second point to take away is actually, in spite of these apparently impressive figures, because they're much better than global averages, it's interesting to see what has been lost since the pandemic. And so if you compare where South Asia and East Asia are now, in terms of where the forecast said they should have been back before the pandemic hit, then South Asia has lost about 35% of what it should have had in terms of GDP cumulatively, and East Asia about 17%. So, GDP is just a number, but I'd like to encourage everybody to think of this not just as GDP loss, but like income loss, loss in public revenue, loss in services that could have been provided but weren't, and basically lost opportunities for many people to make it out of poverty and to get closer to the SDGs. And it's the same with the LDCs and SIDS, very large losses when measured in this way. And for developed economies, it's just about 10%. So everybody was hit, but some recovered much faster than others. Anyway, so lots of ground to make up. I think the main takeaway here is that because developed countries' growth prospects are weak, the opportunities to grow by selling more to them are also limited. So in terms of Asia Pacific doing well, growth has to be driven by additional sources that will help propel it forward. Some of the other things in the external environment, one of them is US inflation. It's very sticky, very stubborn, refusing to come down as rapidly as many had hoped. And that means interest rates will remain high. And that's going to spill over into difficulties in borrowing and difficulties in servicing debt. It's also going to contribute to the fact that governments will have less discretionary spending at their hands, less fiscal space as it's called. And all of this means that overall, many countries will find the investment climate not as robust. Again, Asia Pacific is doing better than the rest of the world. But still, within Asia Pacific too, you will be seeing these things. We spoke a bit about trade fragmentation, and I think one of the things we think about as we look ahead is what are some of the big shocks that could upset the apple cart in a big way. Inflationary shocks are one, whether these are caused by climate-related disasters or changes or conflicts and so on, particularly for food and fuel. Monetary policy, which has been extremely effective in developed countries, often kicks in with a lag. So we are not quite sure whether they might further slow down developed economies. An important part of this is that because governments have limited fiscal space, less money to spend, there's going to be calls for limiting spending, including on social services. Structural adjustment, as it's often called. And while that's not such a popular term these days, it's going to be back. And so I think one of the challenges developing countries have to face is how to not hurt themselves in the process of consolidating their fragile fiscal positions. And then, of course, there are issues of further trade fragmentation. Worryingly, investment in renewables seems to have stagnated as a fraction of total energy investment. So that's not so good for the climate future. And then, of course, we see that there's lots of spending on defense or intentions of spending on defense, which will boost GDP for sure, but maybe crowding out SDG-related expenditures as well.
Well, thank you very much, Shantanu, for your input. Now, Hamza, turning into you, since you are a regional expert, are there any notable predictions for the region or for particular countries that you'd like to tell us about?
Let me build on what Shantanu just said and what the poll is essentially indicating. The two comments, focus on jobs and focus on neither positive, neither negative, right? So let's try and understand the big picture over here, making pandemic as a reference point, as Shantanu was trying to highlight. So just before the pandemic, the region was growing in terms of GDP around 5.5% for 5-6 years on average. It's gradually declining. I'll comment on that in a minute. What does it mean? But after the pandemic, it has been a pickup, but right now the average is around 4.5%. So on average, ballpark numbers are saying 1% growth has been shaved off What does that mean? Shantanu was explaining in detail in terms of prospects of creating more jobs, which essentially has a direct impact on to the extent the poverty can be reduced, which has a direct bearing on government's ability to raise revenues, which in turn then can be used for various public service delivery, has implications for debt GDP indicators, and so on and so forth. So that's at the GDP level, that's what's going on. Just to add a little more nuance, just before the pandemic, the annual GDP growth was tapering off from high of around 6%, I think in 2017 or 2018, to around 4.6% just before the pandemic. And the concerns we were highlighting back then was productivity slowdown. And then once you zoom out a bit more, what we were seeing in the region was a structural transformation taking place, which in simple word means economies were transiting from being primarily agriculture-based economies towards more service-oriented economies, or initially more manufacturing industrial base. But increasingly, since 2010 onwards, increasingly a lot of countries were jumping from being agriculture-based societies to directly service-oriented economies. What does it mean is because productivity tends to be highest in manufacturing and industry, and employment generation tends to be most over there. So when you want to throw this kind of basic understanding forward in time, you want to be concerned about where the jobs are going to come from if the region is not actually industrializing, or the elements of deindustrialization in certain segments of the economy, right? So that's something I want to leave you with, this one basic thought. Once you try and see annual or high frequency GDP growth numbers initially. Getting a little more detail in countries, again, it's not a broad-based recovery happening from pandemic at the moment. Primarily, it's the pickup in China in 2023, from about 3% to over 5% in 23. That has picked up the region. China's GDP is around 40% of Asia-Pacific developing countries' GDP, so China matters quite a bit. And similarly, Russian Federation actually the economy was contracting last year, 2022, and they had a pickup of about 3% growth this year. So primarily, essentially, these two countries had a much stronger performance growth, which lifted the average GDP growth. Others were more or less steady or moderate, struggling in some sense. One key factor that Shantanu also alluded, why a lot of countries are struggling, because primarily, especially Southeast Asia, is an export-oriented region. So exports have been slowing down for some time now, and advanced economies outside the region, like European economies and US, have been lowering their imports from the region because of their own economic challenges that they're facing. So as a whole, the external demand, which had been traditionally a strong boost for growth in the region, has not been happening. But on the positive side a little bit, domestic demand within economies and within the region has actually remained reasonably robust. India is a prime example of that. Inflation is beginning to taper off now, which is increasing the purchasing power of people in the region, and as a result, consumption has remained fairly steady in many economies within the region. Interestingly, the within region trade has picked up more, which is a strong sign in future the region can become more integrated, and there are avenues where it can grow and where the growth can take place. And it goes back to my initial point that in terms of developing a future forward development path, a lot of attention should be paid what kind of services economies need to create, and keeping in view, of course, the context of IT, the AI revolution and technologies advancement and so on and so forth. Do some countries still need industrialization? If so, how are we going to do that? Because you need these things for job creation. Last comment is on, and I'll leave some of the challenges we can discuss in the second round. A little bit of word on inflation. Again, inflation in the region peaked right after the pandemic, 7.2% or so. But the region traditionally does not have an inflationary problems, barring few exceptions in South Asia in particular. Averaging around 3%, 3.3% before pandemic. Now it's about 4.5% to 5% on the higher side, but declining quite considerably. Why paying attention to inflation matters? If nothing else, it indicates that the likelihood of interest rates remaining high is going to be there, which essentially means the ability of businesses to continue investment or expansion or investments is going to be lower, and thus the prospects of growth are going to be lower to that extent. Similarly, the debt servicing of people, businesses, governments goes up, so the proportion of money they are setting aside to repay their existing debt increases, and the result, the resources they can channel towards, at least when the governments are concerned, towards sustainable development goes down. So we need to pay a lot of attention to inflation and then interest rate scenario. Shantanu also mentioned in developing countries in Asia Pacific, whether they like it or not, they have to pay attention to what is going on in US Fed. We can discuss that why that is the case, because US dollar is the global currency, that's why it matters. So if US in particular and European countries keep their interest rates on the high level because of their domestic considerations, the developing countries here will experience the effect of that. It will not be easy for them to lower interest rates, even though their domestic inflation might be coming down, because of risks of capital outflows from the region. And we have seen that episodes again and again last several times, including more recent episodes. So this is just a little bit of the outlook part, comment on that. So let me stop here with one last observation. GDP growth is just a means to an end. We need to pay a lot of attention. What is not the ultimate objective, should not be the ultimate objective of assessing economy strength. What matters is, what is GDP growth doing for the people? In plain words, is it creating sufficient jobs? That's why I'm not surprised when the vote is that should be the main focus. So ultimately, job creation or a people-centric growth, what really matters. There are other considerations of GDP which we normally like to highlight that the quality of growth is much more important than the quantity of growth. So the production processes, the way GDP is taking place, for instance, is growing, should not have a large carbon footprint, for instance, on the environment. And it should be not adding to inequalities, rather it should be mitigating. I can comment on that a bit more, but let's wait for the next round of questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your comment. You're faster than AI. It's like summarizing a long documentary in a few minutes. That was amazing. Thank you very much. Now, Tanyapon, I'd like you to bring you in now. So how do you see this data and forecast affecting Southeast Asia?
So actually, continuing from what Hamza just said as well, so if you look at Southeast Asia, although the region is doing relatively well compared to other regions in the world, but if we actually compared its performance, I mean forecast growth rate to the pre-COVID rate, we'll see that most of the countries are not yet to be returning to its pre-COVID level. And let me emphasize the point that Hamza just said, that this is one of the explanations could be that these countries are very open. We say that exports plus imports take a very high proportion of their GDP. So it's not much of a surprise that under the global, weak global trade, we would see that these countries are kind of a little bit struggling to going back to the pre-COVID level. Okay, so let me give some example of exceptions. So if you look at Indonesia, we know that Indonesia is the country in Southeast Asia that least depends on external economies. Okay, only 50% of its GDP depends on exports plus imports. And if you look at the report, we'll see that the forecast actually says that it's going to be returning back to the pre-COVID level. So we see that from this exception and from the norm in Southeast Asia, there's an importance of dependence on external economies quite a lot. So at the country level, what does it mean? It doesn't only have an implication on the implementation of SDG 1, as we see for poverty. It also has an implication on SDG 10, which is about inequality. We will see that at the country level, there will be inequality of broad brush GDP per capita growth. And even more, if you look inside the country, okay, at the household level, we may see some picture of uneven recovery as well. So this depends on the source of income of the household, whether it depends on export sector a lot or not. Okay, so let me bring in a little bit of my research. Okay, so that's actually from the context of the Great Depression in 1930s, but I think it can give us some insight. So from that research, I find that for households that only depended their income on rice farming, and rice was the main exports at that time, they were harder hit in terms of income when compared to other types of households. Okay, so that's about income. But if you say that, if you're concerned about poverty, and what we concern is actually about consumption, how about consumption? From the research back in 1930s, it says that consumption was actually not different when we compared different types of households. What does it mean? It means that actually households could smooth their consumption even under the crisis. Okay, and I find that that was done through borrowing. Okay, and this, when we bring the picture back now, right now, at this decade, we actually have seen high borrowing and high NPL in some countries, especially in Thailand. We have the record high household debt and NPL. Okay, so this may not be a worry right now about current consumption, but in the future, I think there's something that we can think about, and it concerns the poll as well on the second one, the rising debt. So just would like to bring a little bit of micro picture into the picture. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That's very refreshing. So now that we've touched the surface of how it affects SDG, so I'm really curious to ask all of you and each of you, how does this sort of forecast and information affect the implementation of the SDG in particular? And perhaps Hamza, you'd like to start with this?
Sure. That's what I was alluding to earlier. Once you look at as an economist, we look at assess the economy and link it with different kind of SDG goals and general prospects of sustainable development. The key being is from job creation, because that's the link you see if you look at the data 40, 50 years. Strong GDP growth is needed to have stronger job creation, which tends to have a direct bearing on ability of governments to reduce poverty. So for goal one, if you want to have reduced poverty, it pays off to have sustained economic growth for long periods of time. So that's a direct link with that. So when the economic prospects are not looking great, you can be concerned about impact on poverty. Our latest estimate, which we will be publishing in early April, for instance, shows that 42 million new people have been coming to extreme poverty in 2022. So poverty is increasing. That's one. Other is, and linking it with the comments with the survey results, is on the ability, and again, I think I mentioned that in the first instance, the government ability to respond to different sustainable development, to invest in the public, to pay attention to poverty reduction strategies requires resources, among other things. And slower economies tends to have a direct impact on revenue mobilization, which has all sorts of effect on multiple SDGs. Not the only factor, but one of the critical factors that end up having a big impact. The other is inflation, which in my understanding, and I'm an ex-central banker, so I tend to see it's a bit neglected. People normally tend to think less lower interest rates as quickly as possible so that growth can take place. But inflation tends to be in the background in many instances, and inflation means links with interest rates directly. But we have to understand high inflation really erodes purchasing power of people. It has a direct bearing on the economies in terms of lowering aggregate demand, but people are suffering. They can't afford, especially if bulk of the consumer basket in the inflation number is from food items, which is the case in many developing countries, and food prices are going up. There are food security concerns as well, again having a direct bearing on prospects of sustainable development. So paying attention to inflation makes a world of difference actually for sustainable development. It's not a macroeconomic issue in our assessment, it's actually a bigger, broader development issue. Another nuanced point on inflation. So when inflation is the rate of change of prices. So sometimes people or policymakers get excited saying, oh, inflation has come down from 5% to 3% something. it's time to reduce interest rates to boost growth because inflation is under control. But the price levels have increased. So what you need to look at is the purchasing power of people. For that, you should look at, policymakers should look at the wage data and try to assess what has been happening to real wages. So it may be the case that inflation, rate of change of prices has come down, but the level of prices is still up, and wages are not increasing the same level. So real wages actually may have gone down, and this is something we also highlight in our research. So it takes a while before you actually are sure that inflation is fully under control. Because as I said, if purchasing power has gone down, it's going to have a direct impact on, among others, on food security and poverty concerns. So this is the link we try and develop with overall economic assessments, primarily GDP inflation, and then linking with various SDGs through employment and poverty and inequalities and poverty and those kind of concerns. And one last comment, quickly one, picking again from the survey, debt concerns, for instance, right? That is again something, it's commented typically, perceived typically that debt is necessarily bad. A high level of debt is necessarily bad. In our work, we try to highlight not really. What really matters is how debt is being used. If you are raising the debt and investing in people, investing in the environment, investing in sustainable development as a whole, we have formally shown in our research it pays off over time. So high level of debt right now does not necessarily mean actually countries are in a problem, should not be the case. What we should try and assess is how this debt is being used, and it is increasingly invested in different aspects of sustainable development, and then how you create that space. So put differently, a typical yardstick is used in international commentaries. 60% debt GDP ratio is bad, some magic number. 60% above, some countries are perceived as facing high risk of debt distress. Not really. What we argue is, look at the SDG investment needs up front, assess how much is needed. Maybe it will require to be financed by raising more debt, so be it. So maybe that number is 90% debt GDP ratio. Then work backwards. How do you make sure that money is come forth and where is money is going for? So rather than asking countries like IMF and World Bank does to have fiscal consolidation, to bring debt levels and the manageable levels within 3-5 years, we are saying don't do that. Help the countries actually raise their tax potential, has to develop capital markets and other potential avenues which can actually help them finance those investments that are needed. Once you bring that in, then over time, our research shows both prospects of sustainable development improves and debt levels goes down as well. So just wanted to comment a little bit on the debt side from that perspective also.
Well, thank you very much. It was very insightful. All right, Shantanu, would you have anything to add to this?
I'm going to pick up on a couple of points Hamza made, and then I'm going to take a slightly more, since we're talking about forward-looking planning, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the opportunities that may be there. Hamza made this point, which is generally not sometimes lost, that what really matters for people is whether their wages are rising along with inflation or not. And so if you look at the developed countries, particularly in the US, for many of them, initially the inflationary effect turned into profits for corporations because prices went up. But now you're seeing the other side of things, which is that actually people who are out of the labor market are coming back in, wages are rising. And so the inflation and wage are tending to cancel each other out. And this is kind of reversing decades of inequality in the US. Whether it will sustain further or not is not known. But if you flip that around and you look at many of the Asian countries where unemployment rates are high, there's actually the worker has no bargaining power when the unemployment rates are high to go and ask for an increase in their wages because prices have gone up. So we did a little calculation to see what has been the cumulative increase in the consumer price index, or in the level basically, over the last 2 years of inflation. And in developing countries, it turns out to be over 20%, which means that if your wages have remained stagnant, your purchasing power has gone down by a fifth. That's just on average. And we know that in Asia Pacific, for example, there are several countries, last VDR, Iran, Myanmar, several others, which are still dealing with very high inflation rates. And they have a similar slack in the labor market. So that's an important part of where government policy and private sector growth both have to play a role. As we look forward, though, I think there are a couple of sort of interesting areas for policymakers and planners to consider. The first point is that we are saying that investments have become more expensive. It means that returns on those investments must be greater. And so there needs to be conscious thought in terms of the policymakers, which areas will give high enough returns on investment to be able to worth it at this particular point in time from a purely economic point of view. And some of these are going to be in the areas where the green transformation is going to be happening. So that's an important consideration when you try to distinguish between things that should be financed on a rate of return basis versus things that should be financed more as a rate of return on the social side basis. So governments need to think a little bit clearly about these options. If, for example, the EU and other countries are actually going to say that we will restrict imports that don't have a certain degree of carbon composition in them, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, then maybe this is a good time for the countries that actually produce these items cheaply to ask for the investment and the technology to help them meet those requirements instead of passively sitting by. So we think there's a role here for countries to get together and play. The second point is that the big transformations in energy and technology are going to require new materials. Everybody knows that. There's a gold rush going on for nickel, for lithium, for copper even. The real question for developing countries, many of whom are in Asia, is how can they capitalize on this without making the mistakes of primarily fossil fuel dependent economies that have been seen in the past, where there's fluctuation in the revenue that comes in, very high one year, very low the next, where the revenue that comes in is controlled by a certain set of individuals or small institutions and not shared equally among people. These are all considerations that lead to a well-known phenomenon in economics and perhaps in politics too, called the resource curse. And I think this is important for countries to figure out how to avoid whatever has been learned about institutional design, about mechanism design, to avoid falling into this resource curse. I think there are two other things which I would say is hopeful. One is this whole idea that a strong digital public infrastructure can actually help you deliver services, whether they're public or private. And Asia has been a leader here across many of the countries. This is an idea worth exploring to the full, including taking into account things like advances in AI for delivering education, for complementing how healthcare is delivered. I think building on the digital public infrastructure and rolling it out even more is a fantastic idea for countries to take forward. And the final thing I would say is that many of the ideas that we are discussing here with regard to financing and how the international financing system often lets countries down are really at the forefront of a concerted effort by the United Nations to try and rectify. So if you're interested, you can look at the Secretary General's SDG stimulus plan, reform of the international financial architecture, trying to figure out better ways to resolve debt-related issues, trying to figure out better ways to have access to capital for countries for the kind of growth that Hamza was talking about, for the kind of investment where the returns may only become apparent over a much longer term, even though the financial returns need to be made right away. So these are productive areas where there is work going on and where I think concerted effort by the leaders of South Asian, East Asian, all of the countries in Asia would really help. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comment and for guiding us into how we can study about this more. Now, Kuntanyapon, do you have anything to add to this?
Okay, just picking up from Shantanu on the point that although we are facing challenge, there are opportunities to pick up. And one of the points that he has made is on shifting to green energy investment. Okay, so we know that right now a number of multinational firms actually re-strategy their investment into green products and green process. And actually, even under the kind of more limited global investment, maybe due to tighter global financial condition, countries can actually use this opportunity as a way to reconsider their investment strategy as well. So let me give an example from Thailand again. Okay, so Thailand has kind of repositioned itself, okay, to be kind of a hub of clean energy. And we have a record of high renewable energy usage, and with subsidy, government started to subsidize green purchase, such as EV cars, for a few years now, and that drove exceptionally high demand. So these factors actually act as we manage based on these factors to successfully attract firms that would like to invest in green energy and have need to find host countries that are prepared for that. Okay, so a lot of contracts have been signed now, and we are actually looking forward to new type of investment into the country. So that not only addresses SDG 13, right, on climate change, okay, it will also address this employment issue as well, because this could generate new employment. So I think so based on this, countries can actually use this as an opportunity, okay, to redirect their strategy, and that wouldn't be so successful without support from public sector. Like Hamza said, sometimes public debt can be a good sign, because that was need for infrastructure, and this was what Thailand had been doing for a few years, and I think this could offer some kind of example of opportunity under bleak circumstance. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Tanyapon. Now that you've mentioned that in terms of challenges, there's always positive opportunities. So I'd love to know if you can share your views on if you think there's any bright spots, or if there can be, you see anything hopeful about. We actually have about 3 minutes left between two of you. If you can give some concise answers, that'd be great. Thank you.
I think the biggest untapped potential is actually not having enough women in the workforce. And this is a stubborn problem across much of Asia. And I don't mean, women who are street vendors. I mean actually formal sector employed women. So I think this is a huge sort of missed opportunity. And it is well understood what kind of policies and measures are needed to help put this forward. Many countries are also moving through a demographic transition, which means, in principle, the care burden should change. And so I think this may not be low-hanging fruit, but it's certainly fruit worth reaching for long-term benefits.
Yeah, let me try say something different here. That power of narratives, to me, that has fundamentally changed the last 20 years or so, and I think UN has a big role to play into that. What I mean by that is, traditionally, at least in the economics world, we have been thinking about let's grow first and then redistribute later. Let's grow first and then we'll clean up the environment later on. That has been, and to some extent still is, the mainstream economic thinking. I think that has changed quite a bit, and it's changing very rapidly and creating a lot of opportunities. This is what Tanyapon was highlighting as well. For instance, until very recently, even now in US, the narrative is going towards green transition or addressing climate change is going to take jobs away from traditional sectors. It's been sold as a trade-off, while there are co-benefits involved in pursuing green transition, which actually ends up creating more jobs and promoting growth as well. Until recently, the thinking was that inequality is some social issue that should be paid attention to later on, but let's focus on growth part. But now increasingly evidence is there that high and sustained level of inequalities actually are an impediment to growth itself. So it pays off for policymakers to pay upfront attention to these issues. So this narrative change that I think Sustainable Development Agenda has brought is sometimes underestimated, and it's changing and affecting policies in all sorts of areas, including power of technology, for instance, how you want to use that.
Well, thank you very much for all your answers. Now, I do believe that we have questions from the audience as well. We've been getting questions online on slido.com, so let's have a look at that on the screen behind us. Okay. All right, we've got a highlighted question. How can we tackle the population problem in Asia and Pacific region? A question from Manish Jadhav from New Delhi, India. Are you also in this room? Okay. Now, who would like to take this question? Hamza, Shantanu?
Not me. Okay, we've done some work on this. So I'm not sure you can characterize this as a problem, in the sense that it is something to be fixed, and I mean, let's see what's the big population changes that are happening here. The first is obviously the huge relative growth in the aging population, right, with the various kind of economic and other social challenges that it brings about. And that's actually a success story. People are living longer. So, so I don't know if that's a problem you want to fix, right? The other thing is population sizes are shrinking and population growth rates are falling. I'm sure there are many people in this room who grew up at a time, including myself, when that was not the case and that was considered the problem that needs to be fixed. And I think in a more pragmatic sense as well, many countries, I mean, this is new for this part of the world, but obviously it's been happening in Europe and other places for a long time, have tried to fix this through various means, such as encouraging greater immigration, encouraging incentives to have more children, taking care of some of the care responsibilities that inhibit women from kind of having children when they're faced with this alternative of economic employment, et cetera, et cetera. None of them work. None of them work in the long term. So I think these are not fixable. These are not problems per se. This is the way our lives have become and have changed. It's the question of how to make the best of this situation. Just like 40 years ago, we were struggling to find enough food to, feed growing populations, improve health, et cetera, et cetera. So let's take these as success stories of where we've come and see how to make progress on that.
Thank you very much for your views. I believe we have time for one more questions from the audience, and this one's very relevant as well. Many disruptive technologies are coming up, like AI, bioweapons, etc., which are detrimental to mankind. How to address this? From Dhananjaya, Bangalore, India, and maybe Hamza, you'd like to take this?
Sure. The general principle, I think, is important to understand. When economists think about technologies and AI and these things, at least how I think, you have to distinguish between the impact of technologies on total factor productivity and labor productivity, number one. So automation, for instance, may increase total factor productivity, but if it is going to replace labor, it's going to be problematic because people will lose their jobs and it has all sorts of negative impact, while the overall economy might be doing better. So, and number two is the march of technologies and rise and advancements is nothing new. It has been part of human societies for as long as we know the recorded history, for a couple of thousand years. So we should not be certainly just similar to what Shantanu gave very insightful answers to the population problem. We should not take it problem as such. It's how do you channel it? Typically, it's taken as, technology is going to disrupt labor market and so on and so forth, but that's not the right approach. So it's not an inexorable rise of technology is going to lead to replacement of jobs, for instance. There's going to be bad news. No. How the governments through regulations, and it is one word that Shantanu mentioned earlier, bargaining power of labor in the labor force. These two factors, if they are there, then the 1,000 years of history of human effort in dealing with technological advancement shows that in the end, net on basis, society gains quite a bit. So classic, most recent example, without going details, more recent examples are the period between post-World War II, 1950s and 60s and early 70s. There has been spectacular growth with minimal inequality increases. Right? So there are episodes in the past as well. At the beginning of industrial revolution, for instance, for first 70, 80, almost 100 years, it was just about growth, because the technology then was replacing the workers, not complementing them. And later on, the government started taking regulation, giving shape to those things. I will leave the audience with this reference to a book that I'm going through these days, Power and Progress by Darin Acemoglu and Simon Johnson. It documents last 1,000 years of human effort dealing with technologies. So these two things are critical. Technologies adding to labor productivity and ability of workers to take advantage of that through gaining power, and government through regulation giving shape to those things.
Can I just add something?
Sure, you have 30 seconds.
I want to quote Hamza. I want to quote Hamza back at you and say, we spoke a little bit about this change in paradigms and narratives, and I think with technology too, we have to stop thinking of use it now and clean up later. We need really a more holistic approach. I mean, we cleaned up nuclear weapons after the bomb, right? Geneva Chemical Weapons Convention was the very first global convention, but that came after gas warfare in World War I. So I think learning from these experiences, I think we have to agree that there have to be guardrails, and how we set those guardrails is important, and they have to be done preemptively.
Well, thank you very much. Did you want to add anything, or just giving me a nod? Just very last word.
So I just would like to emphasize the power of education as well. So basically, for the technology and all the weapons that the question has mentioned about, actually we can use education as a way to shape how human actually responds and think about this, not just a formal education in school. I think as people are going to live longer, lifelong learning is very important, and it's not just about increasing productivity or just about labor market, but for other aspects as well, that although traditionally economics is not doesn't touch on it, but I think increasingly I think it becomes a part of social science and economics as well. So I think education could act as kind of a soft weapon against some kind of like downside thought on this as well. Okay.
Well, thank you very much. It seems to be the theme that any challenges or something that seems to be a big problem. After all, we just need to find the right balance, the right regulation, and the optimal usage of it, and that should solve most problems. Well, thank you very much, Shantanu, Hamza, and Tanyaporn, for joining us today. I'm sure that everyone got very, very valuable information, and I learned a lot from listening to the panelists today, so thank you. Thank you for your time. Right now, we are going to watch a little video.
There's an urgent need for all of us to rally behind our sustainable development goals. We have reached the midpoint in our timeline to achieve these goals, but very unfortunately, we have been losing our ground. We need to refocus our efforts and work together to get them back on track. we need to be more ambitious and determined in a way that we make and take our own actions and take our own decisions. And we need to have the bold, impactful commitments. The SDGs are not just 17 lofty goals. They represent real lives with real needs. They represent women and children, young and old, you and me. They represent a chance to fulfill our potential. Ultimately, they represented our shared future. Let's do it together.
All right, welcome back. It's time to now move on to our second panel of today. But before we do so, we have another audience poll for all of you. And the question this time is, what do you think is the best way to support vulnerable groups? Now, vulnerable groups are people like women and girls, children, older persons, indigenous persons, persons with disabilities, and others who face distinct challenges. So I'd love to know what you think is the best way to support them. Is it a seat at the policy table? Is it more funding? Is it more visibility? Or is it removing any stigma around them? Or is it something else? So again, please go to slido.com and use the hashtag WESP to vote. So while you're voting, we have a video from you and DESA. Oh, that was the one that was playing before. All right, okay. So, all right. So if you are voting now, we can quickly have a look at the poll. So in the video, we saw the progress on the different SDGs and that it has been mixed when it comes to Asia and the Pacific. But overall, we're moving in a concerning direction. And if we can all look at the poll result together behind us. Okay, seems to be another clear popular answer as well. So the best way to support vulnerable groups seems to be a seat at the policy table. That's the highest vote that we receive. More funding follows, and then followed by more visibility, then removing any stigma around them. But the most popular vote is a seat at the policy table is the best way to support the vulnerable groups. That's a live result from 48 participants now. All right, so that brings us neatly to our next conversation on smart sustainable development planning to leave no one behind. Joining us now next to me are Dayan Shayani, a statistician here at UN ESCAP, Alison Culpin, a senior social statistician at the Pacific Community and also known as SPC, and Vilani Remengesau, a member of the Belau Association of NGOs, also known as Bango, based in Palau. So first of all, thank you all very much for joining us today, and welcome to the panel. All right, for the first question, as we think about future forward development planning, it's good to have a data to tell us where we are. So Diane, can you please tell us a little bit about ESCAP's latest data on how Asia and the Pacific are faring on SDG implementation?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. And I was very happy to hear the previous panel that also draw a lot of conclusions based on data. And I think from our perspective here in ESCAP, we try to make the most sense of the SDG data that is out there and to be able to use data to guide our discussions. And so today, I would like to just give a very quick overview that you probably already heard earlier today at the opening of APFSD about the situation of Asia Pacific in terms of the SDGs. And as you know, every year, unfortunately, we come here to give you bad news that the region is not on track. And we hope every year that will come with different news, but every year is the same, unfortunately. And this year, We have also recently released a report that looks like this, and this is a brochure that you can have if you want, because we don't print anymore the report, they're online, but we give some main results and highlights in this brochure. And it shows basically that none of the goals is on track. Actually, some of the goals are making a bit of progress overall, but still not enough to achieve them by 2030. Of course, in goal 13, we are regressing as a region. But I think you've heard this already last year, and things haven't changed much this year. But one of the things we have realized this year that we haven't realized before is the depth of the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we tried this year to compare how different groups of countries have progressed since the pandemic. And we noticed that the region of Asia Pacific as a whole has actually recovered in this trajectory towards the targets. However, the countries with most special needs, such as the landlocked developing countries, the least developed countries, and the small island developing states, have not progressed as much as the whole region has progressed. And especially the SIDS, the small island development states, have basically lost all the progress that they have made from 2015 until the pandemic. And they had to start from scratch basically after pandemic, and on the overall picture of the goals. And so now that disparity between countries is actually increasing, with the SIDS actually being the most affected in the region. Also this year, we have also looked at how countries are progressing, and we found some interesting trends where some countries actually have made very good progress and very good trends in certain indicators, while they may not have done in others. So we noticed that across the region, there's really good examples of success stories that countries have made really substantive progress on certain goals. But no country has actually, so to say, been a star in every aspect. So there's a lot to learn from across the region on how we can make progress and how we can achieve the goals together. So this is just a quick overview of our findings this year.
Well, thank you very much. And just turning into Lani and Alison, so I'd like to ask each of you how you see that the economic inequality affecting the lives of people in your communities and other groups of people that are being left behind. So Lani, may I start with you?
Thank you for the question. As you know, you can tell I'm the voice of the community, the vulnerable groups. When we say economic inequality, people tend to see it's just a number, it's a data, it's a statistics, but it's really an issue that impacts those who are in the community. It's an important issue that must be addressed. And I must say, coming from a SIDS country with limited resources, it's an issue that will impact the access to basic services, and such vulnerable groups that are being impacted are persons with disabilities. For us in the Pacific and in Palau, access to assistive technologies is just too high for us to achieve. And coming in a country, in a region where access to assistive devices, even eyeglasses and wheelchairs, it's just too costly for an individual who is low income family, who is a minority. It's just too high for them to pay such cost. Another issue about in economic inequality that impact vulnerable groups is we see that it's a violation of human rights for vulnerable groups. We see that opportunity to economic and opportunities to employment, livelihood, it's a human rights. It's a violation of a person to participate in the society. It's a violation of a person to be included in the society, to access those basic principles in the society. And when we say inclusion, there should be principles and conditions that we must meet in order to say that vulnerable groups are included in the community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lani, for giving us a clearer picture on the challenges that your communities are facing or have been facing. Now, turning to you, Alison, coming from New Caledonia, I believe. We would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Thank you, and apologies as another statistician, we're stacking the desk here, but that does fit with the theme. So I think the SDGs has certainly allowed us to move on from the aphorism that a rising tide lifts all boats. I think that was the mentality, we heard that before with rising GDP, the assumption that that's going to capture everyone and everyone benefits. Again, rising tide is not a phrase to use well in the Pacific SIDS as well. But definitely inequality, even despite some sustained and reasonable GDP growth, inequality has not reduced. The figure we tend to use in the Pacific is that 1 in 4 Pacific people remain below their national poverty line. So that's taking into account the national definitions of poverty. And in a lot of instances in the Pacific countries, a deprivation model is used rather than a strict monetary measure to capture the different perspective of what poverty means. So the SDGs haven't well captured some of the informal safety nets that operate so well in the Pacific. And that really came to the fore during the pandemic. So I think that's something that we want to capture better and to monitor better in the next round of the SIDS monitoring, is this well-being beyond GDP, which is gaining a lot of traction in communities. I think one observation that we're seeing in the Northern Pacific, in Micronesia, particularly Marshall Islands, FSM, is that inequality in access to formal economic opportunities is seeing unprecedented outflows of people, predominantly to the US. So we're losing up to 20% of the total population over a decade. And that obviously has implications for those remaining in the country in socio-economic terms. So yes, there might be some positives in the terms of remittance inflows. The impact on that population going forward is really unknown. And just a final comment, if I may, on since we're talking about data and people being left behind, let's challenge to some extent our assumptions about who these people are and look at it in the local and community context. I recommend, for those that haven't looked at ESCAP's Leaving No One Behind tool, that's a data-driven tool that lets you identify the furthest ahead and the furthest behind against some of the SDG indicators. And there are some surprising results that challenge our preconceived ideas. So it's not always necessarily the people we think are the furthest behind that are coming through in the data. So just another plug for evidence-based or evidence-informed decisions. Thank you.
So it is quite clear that quite a bit of work needs to be done. And what are we going to do about this? And how can better data help us to get where we need to go with SDG implementation? And are there examples from your work that you can share with us today? Diane?
So it's very interesting, this discussion about data, because that it's also part of the idea that we had for this year's report on the SDGs was to look at good stories and success stories. And especially we try to focus on where data has helped create policies and change the way things work in countries to benefit the people. And one of the stories that we found and we reported in this year is that based on the household expenditure survey in the Philippines, the researchers noticed that households with children with disabilities had a higher expenditure than a household that without children with disability, and they quantified that difference, and that research allowed the government then to draft a policy that will provide how's it called, a social protection type of benefit to the families with children with disability, and that way offset the higher expenditure that they face. So there's many ways like this that data can be used to provide policymakers with insights to create policies that will meet the gaps. I also wanted to highlight 3 different areas that from the statistics perspective I've been thinking about, because in the last, as you know, because of the COVID pandemic, we were not able to travel and work with the member states. But since last year, we were allowed to travel again, and I had the opportunity to visit some of the countries around the region and hear a bit more about what they're doing in terms of data, and also how that's connecting with their policies. And I want to tell 3 different stories from 3 different places, and that highlight a special learning for me. One of them is about commitment, because I realized that we come here to these UN meetings and we all agree on the SDGs. We all say that we want to achieve them by 2030. But is this commitment really real? Does it reflect in the policies and the realities in our own countries? And I think this is it's a very valid question, because I visited one country, and here I will not mention the name, where they were very proud of having changed their fleet of buses to electric buses. So now they didn't have any more of those polluting, diesel buses, but now all the buses were becoming electric. But then I was curious to know where the electricity comes from. And as you can imagine, they come from fossil fuel, because there's no other source of electricity in that country. So even though it's a positive development, that actually maybe doesn't really meet the ambition of our 2030 agenda. So we really have to think about what really makes a difference. And in that, I would like to highlight that it's not just for the developing countries, but also for all the countries. We have high-income countries, we have developed countries that also face a lot of challenges with the SDGs. And most of the times, the developed countries see themselves as donors or as supporting a role in the SDGs, while forgetting that actually the 17 goals apply to them too, because many of the targets actually are very, very relevant to their countries too. So that's about commitment. I also have a story about using evidence, and that I think my colleague here, a statistician as well, will agree, which is that we need to actually pay more attention to data and to the evidence. Sometimes data might tell us stories that are different from what we believe. And it's good to be challenged. And I think we should actually be challenged and try to learn something new from evidence. And I'll tell a story that I was in a country in Asia Pacific where in our first day of meetings, we realized that there was no poverty estimate for the country. And they explained to us that there is no poverty in their country because it's a relatively high income country and poverty doesn't exist. So we said, sure, okay, fine, that sounds interesting, sounds good, right? But then on the second day, they decided to take us for a special lunch in one of the traditional areas of the city at a real family, so that we can actually interact with the locals. And when we were having the lunch, it was very delicious, by the way, the family started to talk about the poverty around their area, because many families were affected by disaster, and they were living in poverty. They didn't have a house, they didn't have income, and so with our guests, with our hosts, we looked at them and said, so does this mean really there's no poverty in this country? Maybe we should rethink that. I think I'm going a bit over time, but I just wanted to highlight one more thing is the focus. The SDGs are they cover a lot of different areas of development: economic, social, environment. It's very difficult for us to find focus on the SDGs. But if we don't focus, then we will not make so much progress. So that's why this year also we try to highlight the 6 transition areas, because in that way we can have a framework that can focus what needs to be done and which actions that can yield the most benefit in the longer term for the region.
Well, thank you. So, sure, like we just need to really look deep into data, give more importance to that, and also real exposure to local communities, getting to know them. That should also help with finding solutions, the real solutions, sustainable solutions. Alison, would you like to add anything about how better data can help us with SDG implementation?
Just very briefly then, given
Sure.
our time constraints. Yeah, I think there's an interest and a need. We've focused so much on the indicators and the numeric values of those, but in the Pacific in particular there's keen interest to do that deeper dive, the qualitative assessment. Not just looking at what's not working, but the success stories and what collective actions or strong partnerships have allowed that success to happen, and how then that can be scaled up and applied to the other targets that aren't doing so well. So it's not as comfortable a use of statistics. I think it's a lot more complicated to build those qualitative assessments, but I think that's our goal for the next monitoring phase. Thanks.
Thank you, Alison. Now, Lani, we would love to hear your views as well. So, what do you think? Are there some other solutions or good practices to ensure good SDG outcomes despite the challenges or less than stellar economic projections?
Thank you again for the question. I'm here with these 2 data people, and sometimes for us in the community, the civil society, data is just a number to us, but it's actually for us, we want the stories, the realities on the ground. So I just want to give an example in the interest of time. We in the country, we have limited resources, and we have this for a country that we don't have a building code, and access is always an issue for us. So it was one small project that was taken by a local community groups, and we consider it as a public-private partnerships, and this group was NGO in collaboration with the state government and of course with the main government too, but it was funded by another donor. And this project was building an accessible ramp in one of the park areas, and trying to align with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that we are party to, and with limited resources, of course, we cannot find a ramp that has tactile indicators. So with us mobilizing such resources, it's an example of how the community come together in terms of public-private partnerships, and really build the capacity of the community to know that accessibility goes beyond the infrastructure. It also goes into in ICT, access to ICT, that there are also persons who have vision impairments. There are also persons who have hearing impairments. How are they being able to access the ramp, and how are they being able to associate and then enjoy the opportunities provided in the public parking area. So that's just an example that we as a community, and coming from a small country, we have to mobilize our resources, we have to build the capacity of people in the community, and we have to invest the people, and that in that way we are engaging the community, because after all we do, the strategies and the policies, these are for the people, but are always being think of as an afterthought. Inclusion is always an afterthought, so we have to be consulted from the beginning to the monitoring stages. We have to be consulted in all stages of such process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lenny. And I have just one final question for you, and this is quite different as well. Uh, what do you think about the climate change in relation to the challenges, or how the SDG implementation is going forward?
Well, in coming again in the community that we are being impacted by the climate change, it's always an issue for us coming from a seat saying that climate change is impacting everyone. And for a person with disability coming from a country that has a policy, and I'm here wondering how is that policy being inclusive for persons, not only for persons with disabilities, but for other vulnerable groups? Were they being consulted in the beginning? Were there considerations and principles? And that goes the same for the disaster risk reduction policy. So these are just some of the questions that we need to keep in mind, that inclusion is not an afterthought. We always have to consult the people in the beginning to the end stage, whether it's a policy, whether it's an initiative, or any matters that concern people. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being the voice of your community, and it is very well heard. Now, I think that's all the questions from my side for all the panelists today, but we do have some questions from the audience who are joining. Oh, we have someone from the floor as well. Okay, just handing over the microphone. Could you please introduce yourself as well and let us know where you're from?
Namaste and greetings everyone. Introducing myself, Neeraj Shrestha from Nepal, representing Blind Youth Association Nepal, and I'm the visually impaired youth. Just to highlight on the necessity of data, of data and statistics, yes, we all are aware about how data and statistics are important and how we are struggling to find the updated data, especially in regards to the disability. We all are aware about that. And if we see the community level having lack of data, we have not been able to conduct evidence-based activities, and having no proper data and evidences, we have not been able to influence to our government and non-government agencies to take proactive actions for the strict implementation of the SDGs, along with the CRPT that we have been advocating for. And just wanted to highlight one thing is that how we can bring the data from the ground level, as highlighted by the panelists. So what we can do is that we need to focus on the awareness, how we can bring the data. And there should have the proper guidance mechanism, how we can collect the data from the ground level. So I think ESCAP can take the initiative, and you can ESCAP and other UN agencies can empower not only organization of persons with disability, but all other CSOs who have been working in the community level. And as they have the reach to the ground level, they can bring the data and we can use the data. And yeah, as you said, along with the quantitative data, we also need to have the qualitative data as well. So that's one I wanted to highlight it. And further, one thing that I want to highlight is, like, while talking about the economic inequalities, we also need to think about how we can ensure the access in the financial resources, how we can access to the social protection system, and how we can link with the disability movement, CSO movement, with the academic institutions, so that we can bring the more updated data. So that's I want to highlight. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very valuable input. And Dayan, I see that you might be very keen to add something to that.
Yes, thank you very much for this question. And I see a common theme since the start when we had the Slido poll. And I think the top answer was that people want to have a seat at the table, right? And I also very much agree with that, with also Lani saying the same thing. And that the seat at the table, I was thinking which table actually we need to have a seat. I think there are many tables that we need to have a seat. They can be at the community level, at the regional level, at the national level, at the international level. So there's really many tables that people can influence and need to participate, and the people need to come also with data, and that's why I wanted to really talk to this question, because what we are seeing now is that there is a movement on two fronts. One is that what we call citizen-generated data, which is that data is not just generated by the government through the official and the historical ways of doing surveys and censuses and things like that, but rather people are interested in collecting data on certain topics that matters to them. But that data needs to be produced in a scientific way and in a way that follows certain standards. But we are seeing now more and more a growing discussion around this topic, and it's one that I think the statistics community in the whole region and in the world will be doing more and more work. So this is a very promising area. And the second part has to do with the way official statistics work. Normally, countries will collect data on the issues that they consider important or relevant to them. But that conversation of what issues are important and relevant should be a conversation not just internal in the government, but should include everyone. So when we're talking about what data we need or what statistics we need, this should be an inclusive conversation. And we should bring everyone to the table on that conversation too. And that's something that here in ESCAP, our statistics division is very much interested in working.
Thank you. That's very reflective of the poll result as well, that more seats are needed. All right, we also have some questions from Slido, so let's have a look at this one. How does development planning in the Asia Pacific account for the needs and aspirations of local communities? A question from Justine Mwange, Kampala, Uganda. I'll let you decide who would like to take this question.
Surely we're out of time by now.
No, we have time.
Okay, this is just my reflection. I'll start and then pass on. I think certainly on the Pacific side, we are very consultative in developing new plans and strategies. I think perhaps we have too many plans and strategies, and that can bog us down, and we just move to a new plan instead of really making progress with something we already have. But one other thing that could be worth mentioning in response to this is a recent initiative called the Voluntary Local Review. So this is allowing subnational cities or towns or different areas to replicate the Voluntary National Review, which reports on the national progress. So localising the SDGs and building in that community level aspiration, ambitions and targets for the future into national, regional and global work, I guess is hoping to address that question there. Thanks.
Thank you, Alison. Lani, do you have any final thoughts to share?
Just a very quick one in addition to what Alison's saying. Yes, there's so many strategies, policies and frameworks, and for us in the community we get bombarded with question, okay, so SDG, here we are, what is it for us? So I think sometimes we need to align these frameworks, policies, and how it links together and work well in the community. As such, for SDGs, here I am thinking, okay, if I go back home, I have to ask the community where, give us some of your information, what are you doing? And they will ask me, so just because it's VNR for Palas, we have to do the report, but we have to think of beyond. How is it, because we're doing the VNR, how is it, how we're going to go beyond the VNR, how we're going to go beyond the SDGs. What is it really going to impact the people in the community? What do they get out of it, and how do we work together in being a contributive member of the society? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, there's much, much more to talk about, but we actually have to leave it here. So thank you again, Lani, Alison, and Diane, for your very insightful contributions to this crucial conversation. Thank you. So we have heard how this report underscores the critical role of multilateralism in navigating the complex global economic landscape and achieving the SDGs. It is important to keep working toward the goals and towards equality that leaves no one behind. Many thanks once again to all our guests for answering all the questions, and thank you to you or our audience for your participation. And I certainly learned a lot today from listening to our speakers, and I hope that you did as well. If you're watching this on Zoom, you'll see an exit survey pop up when you leave the meeting, so please do fill it out, and we would really appreciate your feedback as it helps us plan for the future events for you. UN DESA will continue its Global Policy Dialogue series in the coming months, including this Friday, again here at the Asia Pacific Forum on Sustainable Development, where we will be talking specifically about partnerships for small islands. Please go to un.org/DESA to find out all about that. And if you're interested in exploring these economic projections in more depth, the World Economic Situation and Prospects of 2024 is now available, and you will find that also at un.org/DESA. Thank you once again for tuning in, and thank you to our colleagues at UN DESA and UN ESCAP. Have a wonderful rest of your day or night where you're from. So thank you again from me and the team here in Bangkok. Goodbye. Thank you. สวัสดีค่ะ